and welcome back. I think we need a baseline to start this conversation so we're all on the same page. And I'm going to ask if Carlos has some numbers that would help us to understand the extent, growth, retrenchment of hate speech in our national dialogue.
We do track.
Well, hang on. We have to say that you're Twitter.
I'm at Twitter.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, that's why we're asking Carlos.
I wasn't prepared for that question, so I don't have top line statistics to give you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Brian has the numbers. I thought you were saying Carlos had it. Brian has the numbers. My apology. Brian, help us with the baseline.
I am deeply relieved.
So, Brian, with your group, which is the Center for Study of Hate and Extremism at UC San Bernardino.
Cal State. You'll get me in trouble.
Don't say that?
No, we love them too.
Okay, all right. But you have statistics that will help us establish a baseline for this conversation on hate speech.
Yeah, well, let's start with hate crime. And again, I think there's a bifurcation of things going on here. I was going to say, if you remember, I was a history major at Penn. 1869 was the year that the Klan officially disbanded, but it was also the year that Jim Crow started. Now, of course, the Klan continued on, but I think there's something when bigotry gets mainstreamed that the more vigilante and violent aspects may not be the things to look at, but the more institutional aspects. And here's just a great stat. November 2016, and by the way, this is FBI stats because the National Review said I was a tenacious researcher who is in cahoots with left-leaning journalists and Muslim organizations, and accused, by the way, one of our professors of being an Islamist. He's Irish, but oh well, whatever. Facts don't matter much. In any event, November 2016 was the worst November since records have been kept. The day after Election Day.
Worst in what way?
For hate crime.
Hate crime. Hate speech or hate crimes?
Hate crime.
Hate crimes.
Hate crime.
Hate speech is part of hate crimes.
No.
No.
Separate thing. And that's where we're a bit more opaque. ADL recently did a study showing over 4 million anti-Semitic tweets, things like that. And interestingly enough, if you want to know how divided we are, just look at what the Russians were doing. And this is something that our research just came out with USA Today. Thank you so much. Wonderful reporting. Your paper, Washington Post, or your old paper, Washington Post. Wonderful reporting. The Russians tripled not all their ads, but their racially divisive ads running into the election. And then we had the worst November ever. We had the worst fourth quarter in about 8 years, and the only November where we saw an increase in hate crime. And what I think has happened is, let me give you another hate speech thing. We have seen more rallies by white nationalists in the mega rallies. And unfortunately, I go to them. I like to say to my students, I go so you don't have to. But we had more mega rallies, that is rallies of 100 or more white nationalists in the last 2 years than in the previous 10 to 20. Okay? And we've also, let's look at some polls. Last year, there were a couple of polls, 9% of Americans say that neo-Nazi views are acceptable. 9%. And one other quick thing. A variety of polls show that that we are perceiving ourselves to be the most racially divided that we've been in a quarter century. So we have a whole bunch of data points. But what I think is, as the data guy, just in closing here, I did what I thought was a wonderful talk at a university in California, and the guy said, the data is great, but what about the morality of things? And one of the things that we found that I thought was striking was that we had the San Bernardino terrorist attack on December 2nd. 5 days later, candidate Trump proposed the Muslim ban. We did not have FBI data, so we tried to compile our own using FBI standards and model penal code, just for hate crime. And we found a significant increase. And guess what? The FBI data just came out, same thing. President Bush, our center's nonpartisan. President Bush, 6 days after 9/11, here in Washington, D.C., spoke at the Islamic Center and said, Islam is peace. And those people who attack Muslims and people wearing headwear should be ashamed of themselves. Hate crimes dropped from 15 that day to 5 the next day against Muslims, and they declined by 2/3. Bottom line is, we can go with national things, but what I would tell you is you really have to look at local communities and particular groups. Hate crimes against Muslims were up 99% from 2014 to 2016. And last year, 2016, according to the FBI, double-digit increases in anti-Latino, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-transgender, and anti-white. We're very divided.
You didn't say anti-black.
Anti-black is still the largest. African Americans are about 13% of the population, and they've actually been declining as a proportion of hate crime victims. That being said, when I met with Attorney General Holder some years ago, I said, Mississippi counted 0 this year, and he said, I know. So many of the states that have the largest African American populations don't meaningfully participate in the hate crime statistics program. Georgia, Mississippi.
Well, you mean they don't participate, so you don't know?
They're not reporting.
They're not reporting.
I think is what Brian's
That's
trying
what you're
to say.
saying.
Right.
Okay, so let me try to draw a bottom line now as, kind of a foundation for this conversation. So what you're telling us that is in November of 2016,
Right.
we saw record heights in terms of hate speech in this country.
Hate crime.
Oh, hate crime.
Hate crime.
Is it also hate speech?
Let's talk about actually, if I can jump in.
Yeah, jump
Maybe
in.
we can, as the one woman of color on the panel, I have to
Are you sure? Are you sure? I don't know about all right.
I think that part of what Brian is trying to distinguish, right, is hate speech and the relationship or the lack thereof between hate crimes and hate violence, right? The typology that we're looking at is the way that hate speech, or as we define it, xenophobic political rhetoric, is informing the national conversation and perception of, frankly, all of us. Jewish folks, Latinos, Black folks, Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians, right? And we actually, thanks to Brian's work, we now have a direct causal relationship between the ways that hate speech, in particular those emanating from those in the highest political office, are literally translating to a call to action to violently assault our communities. They're being borne out by policies such as the Muslim ban, as well as a wave of anti-immigrant rhetoric, policies, and legislation, record deportations, and the otherization of all of these folks on this dais at the time that the nation is at the precipice of historic demographic shifts, right? The goalpost keeps on moving from 2050 to 2042, now to 2040, with respect to when this country is going to be majority people of color. And at the same time, as Brian was articulating, the white supremacist movement, in fact, KKK chapters doubled between 2000 and 2015, right? So you're seeing a concomitant rise with respect to anxiety, an increasingly racialized political debate, and the ways that explicit attacks on our communities are playing out at a national level as well as at a grassroots level. And so we are seeing levels of hate violence in particular affecting our communities, Muslim, Arab, Sikh, Hindu, Middle Eastern, Arab, South Asian, right? At levels that we only saw immediately after 9/11. In the absence of a national attack, emergency, or tragedy of that scale and scope. And so the levels of division as well as of violence that all of our communities are confronting on a daily basis continues to escalate at the same time that the interactions between communities and law enforcement remain increasingly fraught, right? Even the FBI estimates that for every one hate crime that is reported to the federal government, 40 go unreported.
So what you're telling us is, so Brian said, November 2016, we see a spike in terms of hate crime as well as hate speech.
In the areas that count those kinds of incidents, give you an example, Orange County, California, about a 14% increase in hate crime, but about a 70% increase in hate incidents, which are non-criminal. And could I just interject something? This is international. I go to Europe. We have seen a coalescence of white nationalism into a socio-political movement. And when we have, and we're nonpartisan, but I do not think that the Republican Party of the rest of my family, I've been a lifelong independent, never contributed to the campaign, we're a nonpartisan center. But I don't think the Republicans like John McCain or Bob Dole or even Ronald Reagan, when there were torch-bearing Nazis walking down the University of Virginia in Charlottesville would have anything but revulsion. And I told you, Hewitt, I was sitting in a chair to go on with him in February of 2016 when I had gone to a Klan rally in Orange County, California, and saved the life of the Grand Dragon, by the way.
Anyway, we need to get back
That's
to
the
this
part you're going to
conversation.
slide by.
But what I'm saying, white nationalism, if you look at the polling in Europe and here in the United States, while people might say very nice things about abstractly with respect to race relations, we have tens of millions of people who have the most hardened racial views. 61% of Americans favored laws banning interracial marriage in the year I was born. It then dropped to about 8 to 11%. Now it's back up to about 16%. 36% of Americans say whites are under attack, and 14% say whites are under attack and people of color are not.
Okay, so, but the key point, and Suman, you raised this, is the connection between these
Right.
expressions
Right.
and then what actually is happening on the street and these kind of movements and Charlottesville and the like, that there is a connection between speech and action. Am
Yeah.
I right in that? saying
Exactly.
that?
Let me give you a synopsis, right? We looked at xenophobic political rhetoric and hate violence in the 1 year after President Trump's election, right? We got our own data because the FBI data is flawed. We allow our community members to report incidents to us directly. I can tell you that 1 in 5 of the hate violence perpetrators immediately after in the year after President Trump's election explicitly referred to President Trump, a Trump campaign slogan, or a Trump policy such as the Muslim ban as they were literally violently assaulting one of our community members. 1 in 5.
So, Mark Lamont Hill, when you hear this, it's not, we don't want to be unfair to anyone, but there's a direct connection that Suman's drawing. So we start with what Brian's saying, now we go to Suman, between Trump, hate speech, hate crime.
Yeah, I mean, so we could probably back up another 8 years, though, and also look at the election of Barack Obama, the kind of galvanization of hate groups, and we saw a rise in membership in hate groups, hate organizations. So there's definitely a connection between what happens at the top and how people engage on the ground. Under Obama for very particular reasons, under Trump for very particular reasons. I think the narrative that whiteness is under attack is itself a response to a particular type of policy environment, a particular type of policy disposition. When you begin to see, first of all, for some of it has nothing to do with who's in the White House, right? Some of it has to do with job flight, capital flight. There simply aren't the same jobs anymore. People don't have access to the American dream. People who or the ostensible American dream. People who didn't go to college but worked at the factory, worked at the car dealer. They were to send their children to college and have this great life. And suddenly, that's not available anymore just because of how capitalism works. And they're looking for answers. They're looking for explanations. And at the very same time that this is happening, you see these demographic shifts, and you see a black guy in the White House, and it's very easy to say, hey, wait a minute, we're losing our country. And so I think some of it it's just not a simplistic kind of response. I think sometimes we reduce even the Trump supporter to a very narrow, thin kind of reactionary racism that isn't grounded in any kind of political, economic reality. And I'm saying it's both, right? Some of it's crazy, but some of it is the craziness is a response to something very material and concrete. So they're watching their capital flight, they're watching their job opportunities dwindle, and then there are these other things that they can look to for an answer. And we see this all around the world. We see the radicalization of folk all the time where there's economic disparity. And so it's no different. I'm not comparing Trump to the Taliban per se. But there are some interesting connections between the radicalization of folk in one country versus another. That said, that is then combined with a certain type of policy disposition that normalizes white nationalism and a certain kind of nativism.
And what are you talking about specifically?
I'm going to be very specific. So, immigration policy. When we look at our position on refugees, we start to draw a very, very wide. We begin to cast a very wide net, and we start to say everybody fits in this. We're not just talking about people who have particular radical ties. You know, if you're from Syria, if you're from Somalia, if you're from Saudi, you cool. But if you're from, I mean, it doesn't even necessarily fit to any kind of real political reasoning. But if you're from Iran, no. And so we start going down this list of folk who can't come into the country, and it reinforces this idea that if you're brown, you don't belong. If you're Muslim, you don't belong. If you're Sikh, you don't belong, just because we can't tell the difference. If you're South Asian, you don't belong. And all of these things then are getting normalized under a kind of canopy of fear. And so part of what you see are people who are on the fence now saying, hey, wait a minute, maybe we have to do this to save our country. Then finally, I think there's this other piece of it, which is the normalization process, taking people who were in the margins and bringing them to the center. When we start to have conversations about immigration policy, we start to have conversations about, for example, anti-Semitism there's never been a moment in modern history where anti-Semitism hasn't been prevalent. I can't think of one, right? Not just in the United States, but in Europe. But there's something about a moment where white nationalism gets mainstreamed that makes it easier for those narratives to prevail. There's something also about social media, digital media, that makes it easy for people who may be in their mom's basement, normally just spouting rhetoric, yelling at the screen, to now have a bigger platform for that. So I think part of what we're doing is having greater access to the middle, greater access to folk who are in the margins. And suddenly the hate speech that probably always existed, those people who were always sympathetic to the Confederate flag or the statue of a slaveholder, are now able to kind of rally and organize and galvanize and then step outside. And then when you have a president of any sort who says, there may be some fine people among them. Right? Now all of a sudden they're emboldened even further. So there's some level of causality between what people say and what happens on the top and what happens on the ground, but I also don't want to overstate that and suggest that people don't have agency and people don't have the...
No, we hear you.
You know what I mean? I think some of this is people are already in this space and now these other things push them out.
All right, so just picking up on that point, I wanted to come to Carlos because you're with Twitter. And so what you've heard described here as a baseline, as a surge in this kind of speech, is a challenge to people who run social media platforms. So tell me how this hits your business and what you guys think about your social responsibility, or is it socially responsible to say, this is a playing field and you gotta just trust that all voices being heard is best?
One of the great pleasures of my job is the folks at Twitter are really good at understanding our platform. We don't always understand the connections between IRL, in real life, and what happens on our platform. I can tell you that fewer than 1% of Twitter users are responsible for the vast majority of the really ugly stuff that you see.
You said fewer than 20%.
Fewer than 1.
Fewer than 1%.
You know, Twitter's a 12-year-old company and has now got 330 million people who dial in any given month. In those 12 years, the company went through a fairly dramatic philosophical shift from the Wild West of the free speech wing of the Free Speech Party to an understanding that if you don't feel safe, you're not going to communicate. You're not going to exercise your right. And if you're a woman, a minority, Jewish journalist, sometimes the platform can be a really ugly place for you. And so over time, what we've done is build out rules that say that certain types of speech are not allowed, to give users more tools to control their experiences, mute, block, filter, and then more recently and more importantly to take that burden off of the user, so that people, so that 1% doesn't pollute the entire conversation. We've made some dramatic shifts recently in December, judging not only what you do on the platform, but if you're part of a violent extremist group, we don't want you. Even if you're talking about baking, we don't want you on our platform. And we're also taking the technological steps to be able to do this at scale. We got 500 million tweets a day. How do we figure out the signals that indicate in what can be a really rollicking debate? How to figure out, regardless of whether you're tweeting about a culturally sensitive issue in the South or in a language in Southeast Asia, how do we figure out how people are reacting to your content? How are people the really bad guys, how are they trying to take and hijack the conversation? And how do we not eliminate that, but minimize the appearance of it for the 99% of people who come to Twitter, really to advance the conversation, to talk about whatever it is they care about, to figure out what's happening in the world. And for us, it's not only it's something we believe in because we take our responsibility really serious, but it is, like you said, something that's really important to our bottom line.
But there's 1%, and when you identify a person as a member of that 1%, do you ban them from Twitter?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and one it's a debate: are people redeemable or not? And that came up.
Wow. Deep existential question on Twitter. Yeah.
And there was a debate, inside the company about how transparent should we be about our rules, because there are certain people who really get a thrill about being just on the right side of the rules. And so if you tell people where the line is, they'll get as close to it as they can and try not to break it. But that's not what we found. We found that people who get warnings or 25% get 25% less, fewer abuse attacks, abuse reports against them. And one of the things we do.
Oh, so they respond positively
They respond
to the warning.
positively if they understand that what they're doing is against our terms of service. And another one of the ways we will knock people down if they cross certain lines. But often what we'll do is people get excited, they get piqued about something, and they'll do something that definitely crosses the line, and we'll put them in a timeout and say, look, you need to think about what you've done. And we'll say, this is the tweet, take it down, and until you do, you're in a timeout. And basically, you're in a read-only mode, and you can't contribute to the conversation. That drives people crazy. And 65% of people that are in that state are in it only once. And so, we've made big progress. We got a long way to go, just in terms of advancing the health of the platform.
Do you see that making a difference?
Yes, and it's very interesting. We just had a discussion about this in London, and Twitter, which, by the way, is a wonderful resource for us researchers, because we can find where these hateful things are coming from geographically and all kinds of other things, and at particular times. So what we'll see is like kind of I don't want to say an explosion, but an increase in hateful stuff around certain kinds of events. So when you're talking about hate speech, with respect to two things. One, it is true, a relatively small number of people are doing the worst things. ADL found there was like 1,300 people are doing like the anti-Semitic stuff. It was a very, very small number. But what I think is so interesting, whether it's the virtual public square or whether it's in businesses or elsewhere, white nationalism is now a mainstreamed political part of our structure in a way that it hasn't been, I would argue, probably since maybe when George Wallace ran for president in '68 and carried 5 states. That's a problem, because in other words, the alt-right and these hate groups, they have imploded post-Charlottesville. They're all accusing each other of being corrupt, gay, Jewish, or not adequately bigoted.
Wow.
They can't get these crowds together like they did last year. So what we're seeing now is, it doesn't matter. The payload of that rocket ship is down the street. When we have people like Mr. Miller saying the Statue of Liberty and Emma Lazarus doesn't really count, that's a problem. And when we see modeling coming from the top, that's also a problem. Let me just say one quick thing in closing on this one. I think, though, we have to have some tolerance for conservative views and people who disagree with us on policy whose hearts are in the right place. And that's why at Cal State we bring in conservative speakers all the time, but we don't see that generally. And what I think is becoming, if you look at Pew, we're not only divided with regard to race, we're divided with regard to politics, and we're very much entrenched in that polarization. So we just found in 38 cities and counties in the United States, including the top 10, another consecutive year of increases in hate crime, and especially here in Washington, D.C., interestingly enough. 2018, in the limited number of places that we have data, except for D.C., are down, but we're not even forecasting because we have a conflictual election coming up, unstable international events, and a variety of other things that could take that decline and evaporate it in a minute.
All right, so let me just come back. I'm going to direct this to Mark Lamont Hill, to the point that you're making, that white nationalism is now mainstream, that it's like that's already part of the cake. And with that baked in, to stretch this analogy, then everything is colored by the fact that we now once again have white nationalism as a mainstream line of thought and conversation in our society and in our politics.
Yes, and one thing with Twitter and Facebook taking some of these folks off, what we're seeing happening is a fragmentation with respect to social media. So a lot of the racists are going to VK, the Russian Facebook, or they're using Telegram. So here's the problem. If we get these horrible bigots off the main networks, the main platforms, they're going to self-segregate and have their own echo chambers.
Okay, Mark?
No, it's fascinating. I think it's important also to talk about the way that white nationalism is mainstreamed in society, because it isn't 1968 or 63, where you can't run for president saying, you know, America for white people. So it's much more subtle and nuanced, and I think the subtlety and nuance of it allows for elements of white nationalism to become part of the mainstream dialogue. So the kind of nativism that governs our immigration policy, for example, the type of, it's a really interesting mix. So I was thinking, and I do most of them, I spend maybe 25% of the year in Jerusalem doing field work. And so I'm always fascinated by the kind of relationship between Israel and the United States. And as the Trump administration takes power, he has this really interesting mix of white nationalists who are on the one hand anti-Semitic, on the other hand really strong Zionists, right? So they're able to mix it all in, right? They hate Arabs, they hate Muslims, they hate Jews, they hate everybody. You know, move the embassy, but we don't really like them either, right? And so I'm watching all of that move into the mainstream, and I keep thinking, how has this happened to even Make America Great Again? Is in many ways a kind of a very subtle, soft call to white nationalism, right? It's a harken back to a moment that was great for somebody, not for somebody else, right? There's no moment in the American past that was great for Native populations, for indigenous folk, for black folk, for trans folk. I mean, there's no moment we will harken back to. Remember the good old days for black trans folk? Like, there's just no moment like that. So in and of itself, it's a call, but we've been able to normalize it and mainstream it by not foregrounding white nationalism. It's like Obama healthcare policy. People hated the policy, but they liked everything in it.
Right.
It's that kind of a thing. We don't push the white nationalist overarching framework. We just take all the elements of it and normalize it through the presidency, through public policy, and not just Donald Trump. This is also through the Congress. We have to be very careful to not make Donald Trump the kind of boogeyman, although he makes a great kind of target for a lot of critique. It's much more nuanced and complicated like that, and so much of it is happening on the state level as well. And so for me, again, social media becomes another place where we see that play out. When we see the response to, this morning, talking about Twitter, I tweeted, Donald Trump made a statement, I don't know if y'all saw, about, he goes on Twitter sometime, I don't know if y'all noticed, and he made a remark about the NFL's policy decision about the flag, and he said, people shouldn't even stay in the locker room. If you don't want to come out of the locker room, you shouldn't be in the NFL. In fact, maybe you shouldn't even stay in the country.
Right.
Like, that's a lot, right? But that last statement has become such a normalized thing that now we're kind of, it's like, oh, you don't belong in America. Right? And it's not, it don't make the news because it's Donald Trump, and everything makes news with Donald Trump, but it's not going to be seen as the kind of outrageous, fascist kind of statement that it would if Barack Obama or George Bush or Bill Clinton or Ronald Reagan or anyone other than 45 had said it, because of the environment we're in. And so I think, again...
Wait, break that down. That was because of the environment with white hate speech being normalized?
I think hate speech is normalized. I think kind of proto-fascist, or maybe just flat out fascist, this moment has been normalized. I think that the Donald Trump's extremism is so consistent and ubiquitous that it's unwieldy. I mean, it's hard to, you can't be outraged every day about what Donald Trump says or some of the things that come out, because there's just so much stuff, right? Am I going to be outraged about Kim Jong-un today? Am I going to be outraged about the NFL today? Am I going to be outraged about this? And so I think sometimes the American public is overwhelmed by it. And then
let's ask Suman to join in here.
Yeah.
I was just about to. So I think that I'm going to call a spade, right? The current administration and the policies coming out of President Trump, the policies, as well as the rhetoric, are that of white supremacists, right? Not white nationalists, not fringe, not the alt-right, white supremacists, straight up. And I'll tell you why. Because when you are seeking to separate immigrant mothers from their family on the border after they have crossed the U.S.-Mexico border attempting to request asylum, you are implementing a white supremacist agenda. When you are seeking to exclude Muslim immigrants from this country straight up, including initially green card holders, you are implementing a white supremacist agenda. When you are seeking to eviscerate the contributions of immigrant communities to this country, and when you are seeking to paint us and this is very personal for me. My parents came to this country almost 50 years ago to build a life of opportunity and a future for our family, right? And so the current political conversation that is advanced by the mouthpiece President Trump, but was the product of Steve Bannon, of Stephen Miller, of anti-immigrant movements, and the Federation for American Immigration Reform that has now grandfathered itself into the anti-Sharia and anti-immigrant movement. The implementation of the policies that we are seeing being promulgated from this current administration are seeking to literally depopulate the country of people who look like us. Now, in this moment, because the deportations are reaching levels that we have never seen before, and in the future, right? They are seeking to eviscerate our voting rights. Speaking to Chuck, try going to Texas to register to vote, right? You got to drive God knows how many miles. You have to re-register constantly, and God hope that you don't have someone challenge your citizenship when you show up to vote in the first place. So the operationalization of a raft of policies ranging from lacking access to healthcare reform, to the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act, to the ending of our nation's current immigration policy, to denigrating the civil rights and civil liberties of people who look like me, even though I am not Muslim, are speaking to a very thoughtful agenda that has been incubated in this country for the last 50 years.
So the pushback on that would be that these are policies, and these are policy arguments, but you see
Policies
them...
impact people.
I'm sorry?
Policies impact people.
Right, but you see it as a collective. You feel like you could, on a sheet of paper, list them and say this is a white supremacist agenda.
No question.
That's the way you feel.
I mean, I've been doing this work immediately after 9/11, right? And so in the wake of one of the nation's farthest or most tragic terrorist attacks, we saw the Patriot Act. We saw the Special Registration Program. We saw any number of civil rights and civil liberties policies that challenged the very basic fundamental human rights of so many of our communities, be they immigrant, Muslim, Arab, or South Asian. And the level of operationalizing policies that are far more reaching and that are far more divisive and damaging right now is far worse.
So, Suman, talk for a second to Twitter, if you will, to Carlos, and about this idea, because if I'm in his shoes, if I'm at Twitter, and I'm seeing these policy arguments take place, I think this is legitimate debate. But you see it as white supremacy advertising itself in the form of policy prescriptions.
Indeed. I mean,
So what would you say to Twitter about this?
I mean, I would say to Twitter to keep on doing your job by policing and really looking at the background of individuals who are advancing policies and pronouncements like this, right? People tweet at me all the time saying, I don't have a place in this country. People tweet at me all the time saying that the policies that I'm advocating for our communities have no place in the nation's fabric. Okay, fine. But when people start to tweet at me and saying that I'm a Muslim fundamentalist, or when people start to tweet factually incorrect statements about how hate crimes were far worse when the Kenyan-born President Obama was in office, right? That is, I think, a moment for at least review. I love the idea of a timeout. I have a toddler. Toddlers need timeouts too, right? But it needs to be far more, I think, than that. And I think the ways that we saw social media utilized as an instrument of fomenting division in this country in particular, as we now know, we have already seen the damage from that.
And I would just, it's hard to listen to this conversation and not get fired up, but Twitter tries to be a neutral platform and let people on all sides of the debate discuss the issues. I think just touching a couple points that have been going through, Charlottesville was a hard day for a lot of people, especially us that were watching it online and seeing the discussion happen. But what you saw, if you were paying attention to the macro numbers, is civil society coming out and rejecting that. And in the midst of that, Barack Obama's tweet, quoting Nelson Mandela, that no person is born hating, becoming the most liked tweet in history. And I think it's important to recognize that in the ecosystem of politicians and sensationalism, everybody has a role to play, and the symbiotic relationship between your traditional media and the more extreme politicians. At the same time, what platforms like Twitter and services like Twitter have offered is allowing some minority voices that would never have the chance to rise into the mainstream to lift there. Ferguson, Black Lives Matter, more than 5 million tweets about that. The Me Too movement, hashtag Me Too. It's hard to say Me Too without the hashtag. We're proud of those things. We're proud of the things that kind of lift things that had been traditionally ignored into a broader mainstream. But that being said, all these things that you're talking about, abuse, things that don't add to the conversation, that don't add original ideas, actual facts, we're all looking at, and we're trying to figure out as a very small group of employees. We're 4,000 employees around the world. How to distinguish the noise from the signal. Who are the right people? The eyewitnesses, the journalists, the politicians, the experts, the academics. How do we make sure that those voices do that? And how do we do it in a way in 100 different languages? And so it's a hard challenge, but it's one that we're working on every day.
So I want to open it now to your questions to make sure that we can get you all in. Charlie, how much time do we have?
15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay. Do you want to start?
Sure, I have a question. Thanks for being here today. My question is really about the signaling and dog signals specifically. So I'm a product of activists, born in California, raised in California, and product of activists, and I do believe in dog signals or dog whistles. And today or yesterday, NFL said we're going to suppress the right for our players and employees to take a knee during the anthem and et cetera. And I really look at that as an opportunity for corporate America to really start to strengthen their policies about what their employees say or cannot say. And I'm curious to know your thoughts about when the employees or corporate America starts to suppress a voice, how hate may rise up, or how other hate speech and or hate crimes may rise due to the fact that they don't have an outlet to have open discussion among their colleagues at work. About how there may be a connection or tie between that. I'm curious to know if there's been any research or data or just trends that you've seen that may link the two.
Well, Brian, I think that would be aimed at you. Do you see evidence of suppressed thought then leading to speech branching out or being pushed out into other venues? You spoke about going to even Russian websites to speak out.
Boy, this is not going to be popular, but my mentors were my father, who was a POW in Nazi Germany, Elian Higginbotham, who I started work with when you came out with Eyes on the Prize, God bless you, and Gerald Gunther, who escaped Nazi Germany and became a First Amendment scholar. If you want to make martyrs out of haters, ban their speech. If you want to put it out in the sunlight. That being said, there are certain things with regard to harassment and other things that I think companies, as Starbucks is a meeting place, so is Twitter. And I think that, unfortunately, there are, the policy debates that are going on, though, are not so much about policy. Let me just say this. President Obama, God bless him, deported a heck of a lot of people.
He sure did.
But what he did not say was, these people are not worth our respect and dignity. And that's something that you're not going to be able to manipulate through some kind of mechanistic thing. And what I am worried about, and Martin Luther King said this in a speech that was not his most prominent one, about the Emancipation Proclamation. And he said that every great president was tortured by the question of race. And what we have had is a time where white Christians are now in the minority. And I think the president has hit that vein, but he didn't create it. And we're going to have a problem going forward, no matter who becomes president, if we end up not having that kind of difficult conversation. I tweeted Prof. Levin, Term in Yellow, which talked about the vigorous free speech to have anger and debate and all kinds of things to get to truth. And I'm going to say, I think, except for the most horrendous types of things, when we know what it is, threats of violence and use of various epithets, that's one thing. But ideas, you know what? democracy is hard work. And as President Obama said, don't just boo, vote. And what I think, as he said, if people get engaged, that's a good thing. And what I think you'll see is a response to what has happened. So I am against, even in the corporate world, because you are almost like a utility. And I
You're against suppression of any speech.
within certain limits. But you know who they're going to go after first? The black NFL players, the NAACP versus Alabama. We've seen it. When free speech is going to be tinkered with, it goes after the most vulnerable and the oppressed.
Okay.
One of the things that that is a guiding principle for us is just deleting a tweet doesn't delete the ideology behind it. And as Brian said earlier, taking these people off of our platform pushes them deeper into the dark web. And so one of the things we try to do as part of our philanthropic mission is reach out to those groups who are looking at these folks and offering the counter speech. And we have wonderful stories about people who have been de-radicalized. There aren't enough of them. We need more of them. But that kind of rollicking debate sometimes can bring people to change their mind.
Okay. We have another question.
Yeah, to Carlos. Yesterday, a federal judge in Manhattan ruled that President Trump's Twitter feed is a, quote, designated public forum. Is that something that you agree with?
Oh, this is where they stopped him from blocking people.
Correct. Well, he hasn't stopped them. The judge has ruled it unconstitutional. So my question to you is, do you agree that it is a public forum, a designated public forum? And then what would happen if the president did tweet something that was against your social policy?
Boy, that reading the decision was surreal. To hear a bunch of high-powered, high-paid lawyers talk about the tools that we have in our portfolio. We again try to be neutral on these kind of things, and the laws across the world, and we operate in all countries except for China, Iran, and Cuba. Have very different rules about this, and so what we try to say is we want to facilitate all public officials to follow the rules of their country, and that's what we'll do here.
Yes.
Okay. Hello, my name is Danielle Reed. I am a journalist and a graduate of Syracuse University, class of 2016. Woo woo. I thank you so much, panelists, for educating us with the statistics about the correlations between hate crime, hate speech, hate violence, and things like that. What I was really, really surprised that didn't come up during the discourse of this panel, in terms of, of course, talking about Twitter and what its role has played in the last 2 years or 3 years of this Trumpism and the rise of the wave of racism and things like that, is news. And like Mr. Lamont Hill was trying to, or I think kind of made the point of, white supremacy has been mainstreamed. That's a fact. We all know it. We can watch it every day on TV or go online. But what I would like to hear you all kind of talk about, and what it really pains me and kills me to my core as a journalist, is knowing the fact that it was mainstreamed by embracing lies and embracing hate and racism, which is historically has been rooted in our country's history. But in terms of news and what that looks like in terms of the media, in terms of portraying and again pushing this ideology, pushing hate speech, pushing all these negative.
What news are you talking about?
All news. Pretty much, as a journalist, it was hard for me to watch, the campaign of 2016 with Hillary Clinton versus,
So you're saying just coverage of the campaign?
Yes, coverage of the campaign and by way of compared to when President.
But what choice would media have but to cover a national presidential campaign?
So in terms of facts, like
I think she means how we covered it.
How we covered it, and
I think she's saying how that's covered.
When Obama ran, he had to pretty much be this perfect, don't find any dirt on him. He had to be a perfect kind of candidate. And of course, we all know that if he ran saying anything under the rainbow that Donald Trump has said in the last few years, he would have been, completely putting himself at a possible disadvantage to lose the trust
I see your point.
of a country.
Let me start to get it there. So I think I hear what you're saying. So certainly Donald Trump had a little more latitude.
Yeah, I guess my question is
I got you,
why are the lies of we're not racist but we're pushing racism?
I totally got your
How is
question.
that
I was just
able
stepping
to-
in at the end of it and backing into the beginning of it.
Right.
So, but I think that the idea that Donald Trump could run on lots of stuff and say lots of stuff that maybe Obama couldn't do has more to do with the kind of racial logic of America than it does the media itself, right? I'm not sure that the media could have represented Barack Obama in a way differently that would have yielded a different result. That said, I do think that as media outlets, we have to be responsible for how we cover elections. I don't want to name names. This stuff gets you fired up, could get me fired, you know. But I will say, having worked at Fox and CNN, Fox during the Obama campaign and CNN during the Trump campaign, it is interesting to see how media outlets are covering us. I also work at Huffington Post. I'll give you an example. Huffington Post, we made a decision to cover, which I strongly disagree with on the record. Ariana wasn't happy, but I said they decided to cover Trump in the entertainment section for the first, throughout the summer. And I said, this is a bad idea.
This is of 16.
16. I said, this is a bad idea. I said, one, he could win. They all laughed me out of the room, right? I said, one, he could win. But two, a significant sector of the American public has chosen him as their nominee. We're not in the business of picking winners and losers here. We can't do that. If he's the nominee, we should cover him in politics because it's politics. So I think too often we were trying to overdetermine the outcome of the election. Or in other cases, I'm picking Huffington Post because I don't work there anymore, but in other cases with cable news outlets, I think there's a conversation about, I think there was an idea he's not going to win anyway, so let's just continue to not fact check. Let's continue to not push him. Let's continue to not drain him. He ain't going to win anyway. And the money is in showing Trump, just like the money is in missing airplanes, just like the money is in missing white women, just like the money is in tragic bombings, just like the money is in storms, right? I'm talking about all news outlets. We cover this stuff in a way that isn't about yielding sometimes a better product for the audience, so
Or
that
the
they can
truth.
so they can make a determination for themselves. But it becomes about profit making. Yeah, truth, cool. I mean, but we might have competing ideas about what truth is too, right? There's no capital T truth that we could all appeal to. But we could at least fact check. We could at least say, okay, this isn't true. Let's show why it's not true. And let's have a conversation about it. Let's go through sources as opposed to having a random strategist. That's the cool name for people on TV who don't have a job. I have a random strategist say, this could be the Taliban. There's no evidence that Taliban has anything to do with Barack Obama wearing a tan suit, but some might say it's the Taliban. Suddenly that passes for an opinion, right? And it's shielded because I said somebody could say that, right? So that becomes the game that we begin to play.
It's the commodification of sensationalization.
That's it, exactly. That's precisely what it
But
is.
can I interject one quick thing on that? By the way, I love your commentary. Go Quakers and Owls.
That's it. It's that pen love right there.
That's where I got my start in this work. One of the things I think people are forgetting here in D.C. is there are a lot of places in between, and I go there, where prejudice is an attitude, and it consists of three components. It consists of a perception. It also consists of an emotional response and then a behavior. For many voters, talks about bans and walls weren't about facts. They're about symbols that responded to a fear. And if you go back almost 100 years ago to the Klan, when the Klan hit its zenith, it obviously still abhorred African Americans, but it got its base together on something about fear of change, industrialization, the shift to that kind of economy, going from small town to urban, jazz era decadence, communism, international events. Help me, things are changing quickly. I don't know about everything about this candidate, but you know what? He's going to stop whatever's going on and give us a timeout because all these changes, whether it's people speaking Spanish or people going to houses of worship that look different, is scary to me. And at a time when demographic changes are changing and our trust in the communal institutions that hold us together, also among African Americans, has declined. So we don't have this common bond of creed, institutions, and processes, which is why it's not just about race, it's about an assault on the press.
Absolutely.
Well, let me
And
just
a
come
variety of
back.
other things.
Let me just finish up, though, on her question. Simone, I'll just direct it to you because we have other questions. We want
Sure.
to make sure we get them in this time. That facts, and you can have fact checking, we were talking about earlier, and I think it's said that Donald Trump has told some record number of lies,
Right.
as determined by fact checkers, not subjective but people say you can verifiably establish that this is not true,
Sure.
right? Does that make a difference in terms of this conversation about hate speech?
Unquestionably. I mean, when you have when you have a national debate that is being led by the highest bully pulpit in the nation, that is founded on lies, and that is founded on lies to whip up sentiment that advances division, you have a poisoned national debate.
I'm sure that his supporters would say, you guys may be misinterpreting, and he's speaking to some larger issue here. And maybe, for example, the whole argument about calling members of the MS-13 gang animals.
Right.
That people like me here, you are dehumanizing fellow human beings, no matter how horrific the crimes they commit may be. Other people say, no, those gang members are animals. What do you hear?
I hear a dehumanification of people, and I also hear a willingness and an insistence on not actually adhering to the facts. I'll give you the example.
But what's the fact there, see?
The fact there is that I say that any human being, even if they're a Mara Salvatrucha MS-13 gang member, is an animal.
Right.
I would say that they're a person who probably committed a horrific act, but I would also say that every person from Central America is not automatically someone from MS-13.
Right.
That is the statement that is being advanced by this current president.
All right.
And that's the truth that I'm talking about. Calling someone an animal is not okay, but he's made it okay. And I said, it's been years. I said, if they're lying to us now, they're going to lie to us 2 years later, and the lies are still being told, and it has to be stopped. That's why I asked the question. Thank you.
And I would add that Malo Salvatrucha is here because the United States was sending $4 million in arms a day
That's right.
to El Salvador in the 1980s. That is exactly what produced the Malo Salvatrucha. I'm Karen Fleshman. I'm the founder of Racy Conversations. I live in San Francisco, which I would argue is the modern day of white supremacy. And my question is, you alluded earlier to the Facebook ads that the Russians bought. They targeted race because they understood that was the divisive issue. And I see across all social media platforms making money from hate. They silence black activists when they become too radical. They allow incredible bullying and harassment of people who are speaking out. And yet they remain tremendously profitable. And I'm glad to hear that Twitter leadership is interested in self-regulation, but I don't see it at Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, all of them. So what are we going to do as a society, as a government, to regulate these industries so that they don't continue to have such a downward effect on race relations in our country?
Well, Carlos, one of the things we've seen here recently, speaking of Washington, is, government talking to people like Zuckerberg about Facebook, and about other, and I think he's over in Europe this week, and they're talking to him about regulating social media. What is that? Is that a threat to you guys at Twitter, or how do you feel about it?
I think it's going back to San Francisco. Our company's made of engineers, and project managers, and they really hate murky problems, but they realize that they have to get into them. And how we think about these things, whether you're talking about hate or misinformation or disinformation, there's certain indicators that we have used for a long time about what our platform, how it's doing. How many people do we have? How long are they spending on the platform? How much revenue are we getting from our advertising? And that's something our guys can aim at. If we turn it from a like to a heart, it's gonna make a difference, right? So to give our engineers something to aim at, our CEO Jack Dorsey said, we need more numbers, we need more metrics, and so we talked about the health of the platform on 4 which is, do we agree on what the facts are, and how do you measure that? Do we agree on what's important? Meaning, can the system get distracted? Oh, look, the real situation is the Muslim ban. No, it's not. It's this. It's the uranium mine. Whatever it is. 3, are you exposed to different perspectives? So if I think that the sky is best when it's blue and other people like the sunset, are you getting both of those? And then the receptivity, meaning the opposite of toxicity. So if we disagree on whether dogs are better than cats, at least we can have a conversation that's reasonable. And so those are the numbers that we've gone out and asked academics, asked think tanks to figure out with us what can we actually measure with the data that we have. We had 230 people come to us, different institutions, and say, this is how you do it. What we're going to aim at is to have those be public and say, in addition to our revenue numbers, which we're going to report to our shareholders, what are the numbers we're going to report to the American people and to democracies around the world about what our health is. There is a place for regulation, and one of the regulations we're working hard for and supporting on behalf of our company and our users is net neutrality, an important principle that what succeeds online shouldn't be your relationship with an internet service provider, but the strength of your idea. We compete on these issues. We try to make our platform safe because we know if we don't, somebody else is going to steal our customers away from us, our users. And so there definitely is a place.
We're down to our last 2
lightning
questions.
round, yeah.
Oh, last 3 questions, excuse me.
Hi, my name is Ola. I'm a social media ambassador at the Aspen Institute. And my question is about inserting disability rights with regards to race into the national conversation about immigration policy. I'm of West African descent. My parents are immigrants, and I'm reminded constantly if I was born in Nigeria that I wouldn't survive. I'm the survivor of a heart and kidney transplant. Survivor as well, so I'm not supposed to be here anyway.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Thank you. But this goes to the conversation about immigrants with disabilities who are being abused in ICE custody, those mothers with sick children who are bringing them here for medical treatment when they are separated from families, and how do we insert that into the national narrative? I'm saying this with regards to race because the disability rights movement for a long time has been very white and very racist. And you can see that in all of the arrests and all of the protests surrounding Medicaid. There's a reason why there are only white bodies being carried out, white people being carried out of those congressional offices. A white body is more sympathetic than a black body. And if I am carried out into police custody as a black person with a disability, will I survive?
So what's the question?
The question is, how do we insert disability rights with regards to race into the national conversation about immigration policy?
Anybody want to jump on that?
I can jump in. I come from the immigrant rights movement. I think that I welcome and I really appreciate you being able to flag this. I think that there are, particularly with the fight around temporary protected status, the wave of amazing activism from, in particular, UndocuBlack network to be able to really insert the needs and priorities of Black undocumented communities, particularly those that have TPS, have been able to enlarge the debate, right? So that there's an understanding that the evisceration of our nation's temporary protected status policy, refugee and asylum policy, impacts a huge swath of countries that include people who look very different. And that should absolutely be granted the same opportunity and rights and access that they should enjoy in this country. Speaking as an activist who organizes direct actions a lot, I will tell you that I am really nervous sometimes, very frankly, about putting people of color in the throes of interactions with law enforcement and with people who are in the federal government, because I can tell you that Capitol Police, that Secret Service agents, and that far other people in law enforcement look at people who look like you and me and us very differently. And so maybe it's the mom in me, but I get very protective. And so I want to make sure that we are being very honest about the risks associated in this current moment in particular with elevating the voices and the faces of individuals in this particular moment with this particular administration. So I want to make sure that folks like you are coming into that calculus with eyes wide open. But that does not mean that we can't tell your story on social media. That doesn't mean that you can't tell your story yourself right here. And that doesn't mean that we have to have a one-dimensional view of who we are as immigrant communities in this country as we continue to forge a path forward for all of us.
Okay.
Real quick, it also means, though, because I want to get to the disability part of your question, because I think what you said is absolutely right. We have to operate at the intersections with our activism, and we have to avoid a kind of respectability politics that says that we want perfect victims, right? So we don't show the trans person who gets killed by police because that's not as sympathetic as a cisgendered person. We tend to show people who are going to graduate high school versus, or we say he was going to college, as if that makes him less worthy of death than if you didn't. And similarly, we don't show other able bodies in the very same way. So we have to be willing to have that conversation. When we talk about school access, we have to talk about disability. When we talk about people who are victims of gun violence in Chicago, we talk about people who die, but the people who don't die often become disabled. And we don't have that conversation. There's a great book by Lawrence Ralph that gets at this idea. We have to have disability studies at the intersection of all of our work. If we don't, then we're going to always have a group of people who are erased.
And the biggest gap as far as communities with regard to hate crime, reporting with regard to disability, very low. But the victimization surveys, which show about 208,000 hate crimes, the biggest gap between reporting and surveys, residential ones, the disabled community, and also that intersectionality, where we're seeing homeless people being murdered, and a lot of them are people of color, or transgendered people who are being murdered. Why aren't we getting this covered? Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a bill before Congress called the Anti-Semitism Act, which would criminalize certain criticism of Israel. Do you support that, Mr. Levine, as well as Amazon removing from its shelves books by Holocaust skeptics, aka deniers?
It's Levin. Free speech means free speech for dumb speech, stupid speech, speech we hate, and speech that's bigoted. So absolutely, I'm against these bans. I go to Europe, I tell them that. I go to Canada, they say, you're American, we don't want to hear you. But what's going to happen, we can start banning the Holocaust deniers, but then it's going to be Black Lives Matter.
Right.
But there's also a gap between Holocaust deniers and people with a critique of Israel.
Right.
And both of those things just got lumped into the same question, respectfully. So people who deny the Holocaust, okay, we can see that as an ideological extreme, but much of the legislation that we see going through, we saw in New York and other places, is boycott, divestment, and sanctions. That's also been criminalized.
Right.
Critiquing immigration policy in Israel,
right.
critiquing settlement expansion, critiquing
Exactly.
the deportation of Rwandans and Eritreans and South Sudanese people from Hulat in the Negev. So there's a lot of stuff here that gets lumped in. And I think part of the danger to both of you made this point earlier, is that the slippery slope of banning hate speech is that it's not just the most vulnerable and the black and the brown who have the least popular opinions. And we're still at a moment where the Zionist narrative is so central to how American politics functions that a critique of Israel is seen as anti-Semitic as such oftentimes.
Right.
And if we get into that idea of legislating against that, not only do we compromise free speech, we also compromise our ability to have a principled critique, I think.
If I could just add, there's plenty of talk about the unintended consequences of regulation. That happens all the time. You got to be recognized that NetDG, which is a German law, also criminalized hate speech on platforms around the world. The Human Rights Watch put out a report that said too many platforms now are over and taking down a lot of speech that is criticizing Nazi ideology and doing things like that. We see governments around the world, they know that we won't take down dissident content if somebody reports it to us as terrorism, but because of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which is a anti-piracy rule, they'll report them as pirating music, right? So we have to take that down because the fines are so big. And there's an appeals process, we can get it back up, but in the meantime, the conversation has moved on, and so it's squelching really important speech.
Just explain that to me again. It's
So,
music?
basically, I'm not going to name names on the government, but they won't say this person who disagrees with Presidente are terrorists, right? They'll say that these people are stealing music, right? Regardless of whether there's any music on there. And because we are required by American law to move very quickly on that, we'll take it down and then there's an appeals process. If they came to us and said, these folks are breaking our domestic laws, there are many countries around the world where being LGBT is against the laws. We don't action that. But if they come to us and say, that they're
So
pirating
they're
music.
they're
playing
gaming the system.
against,
Right.
They're gaming the system against you. And so, we are really cognizant of our role in lifting up those voices that otherwise don't have a place. The dissidents.
Charlie, I see you're standing there. Do we have time for the last question?
Just a very quick question. Try to make it quick. This is the House of Free Speech, the First Amendment that we're standing in here, and this is what's at the core of this whole discussion. And I hear Twitter saying that they're trying to do something to modulate this by taking down certain things. I can't believe that this isn't really being done by artificial intelligence. There couldn't be any way of doing it without really technical machinations going on. But at the same, which is reasonable. But at the same time, isn't it required of a responsible journalistic source, like any media source, to have a kind of editorial board, a policy? What do they stand for?
Right.
We stand for free speech, but what else do we stand for in more specific terms? And put that out there in front of the people, and then put your artificial intelligence to work on it. Doable or not?
Good question.
Yes, it is, but there's never going to be an end point. Last week we rolled out exactly what you're talking about. We're 4,000 employees. There are 500 million tweets a day. There's not enough people in the world to keep track, especially when you're talking about video. And so what we announced last week is trying to figure out the signals that indicate to us that things aren't contributing to the conversations. Let's say I tweet to everybody on stage. He blocks me, she mutes me, you report me, and everybody else in the room doesn't like it. It's still a strong signal to us that it's not contributing to the conversation. So we won't get rid of it. We'll just make it a little harder to find so that the real things that are moving the discussions on all sides of and we test these things, by the way, all the time against bias. Our initial test on this rollout is it reduces reports of abuse by 8%. That doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're talking again at scale that we're talking about, it's pretty substantial. But we're never going to be done, because it is also a cat and mouse game between the folks who.
What did the statement say?
Which statement?
Well, I thought you said you just put out like a policy or a philosophy.
It's not. It's a behavioral-based effort to use our deep learning, machine learning, to figure out ways to identify really contextually very difficult things to figure out.
I think you were saying, why don't you put out a policy that represents the company, and then you would have the engineers figure out
And the other piece of that too is that we have terms of service against everything that Professor Levin was about. You can't threaten people with violence. You can't use racial slurs over and over again. But there are a lot of things that aren't against our terms of service that people still think are wrong. And still don't want to see, and we're exploring what we call that gap, the margin between the things that are clearly violative of our policies that people and the things people react negatively to, or importantly, that are trying to hijack the conversation in a different way. Let's say we're having a conversation about immigration policy, and somebody comes in and throws in a bunch of bombs on other things, and it doesn't add to your experience as somebody who uses Twitter. And so the thing about algorithms is decisions, and they don't get tired, and that's their big advantage. Is that you can look at the 500 million tweets and figure it out, but the inputs really matter, and we take that responsibility really seriously. So we're constantly A/B testing on those things, and trying to get better. We're not there yet. We're not where we need to be, but we do take it extremely seriously.
Carlos, you know what happened to us? We posted a Twitter from the Russians that said like illegal immigrants are coming over and all this kind of stuff, and Facebook took it down. We were doing a critique on it. So algorithms have their limits too.
All right, Charles.
So thank you, Brian Levin, Mark Lamont Hill, Suman Raghunathan, and Carlos Monet. Juan Williams for moderating the whole day.